Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Cardinal Careers Podcast. My name is Jessica Weicha. I'm one of your career peer advisors at North Central. Today we have Barbara Faust, one of our directors of career development, and we also have a former alumni here joining us, Becky Karnasak. She is a senior HR coordinator at Millennium Trust Company, and we're here today to talk about interviewing. Some tips, some tricks, some mistakes, and kind of how things have changed with COVID coming along. So we'll just start it off by asking, Becky, how has the interview process changed since COVID began?
Yeah, I think the interview process has seen one of the most drastic changes since COVID began. We, prior to COVID, had all of our interviews in person beyond that first phone screen. And so we had to very quickly shift from having multiple in-person interviews to setting up Zoom interviews and now even Teams interviews as we've improved our technology. But it's been a large adjustment because a lot of how our managers are trained to interview is your body language and how you present yourself when you do come in for an interview. So there's that component of training our managers. And from the candidate's perspective, there's a lot more to consider now. It's not just what you wear and are you prepared. Is your dog barking? Is your spouse or your significant other walking through the frame? Are your brothers and sisters around? So it's raised the, I think, anxiety level of many people, but it has a lot of benefits too, because we're able to move through the interview process quicker, which is a great benefit, especially for those looking for roles quickly.
Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense. I like the movement. So you just mentioned several things. So just as we started this podcast, the doorbell rang. I had to tell my husband, I'm like, you have to answer the door. And then he went back into the frame. So everything that could possibly happen happened to me. And you know what? It wasn't the end of the world. So.
And I think it's all how you react to it too. I mean, if the dog's going to bark or your significant other walks through or your brother or sister screams when you are interviewing, keep your composure, stay focused on the conversation. You're never going to be able to control your environment. It's great if you can let people know, hey, I need that time from 10 to 11, for example, to not be interrupted. But it's all how you react, because how many times you get into the office and something doesn't go your way, and we just have to keep our composure and keep moving on.
I'll share one of my experiences being a senior interviewing during COVID. I remember logging on to an interview, and I have pets at home, family at home, so, made sure they were put away, kept quiet. But then I logged onto the interview, and it kept crashing. Every single time we logged on, I couldn't see him, he couldn't see me, or the sound went off, and I was freaking out because it was a 30-minute interview, and we spent 15 minutes with technical difficulties. And I think that's kind of like worst nightmare scenario. It's like you're expecting an interview, put your best face forward, and then you're like, oh my gosh, like the internet's not working, Kind of how I went about that, and a little tip I'll throw in is I asked for their phone number at the very beginning of the interview so that if the internet did go down, I could just do the interview over the phone, which isn't ideal, but in our case, it actually ended up working out for me. And so I kind of wanted to share that experience because it happened and I still ended up getting the job. Like, it didn't affect me in the end because I still had 2 interviews after that. But that was definitely probably one of the most stressful things I had, was joining the room and not seeing my interview person over and over again.
And I would say too, I think that's a great tip to get their phone number. And I actually had a similar experience when I was hiring someone. And I think the best thing you can also do is say, hey, can we FaceTime? Can we use a different application? Because there's so many ways in 2021 to be video chatting in some capacity. So if Zoom's not working, if Teams isn't working, see if there's an alternative video capability that you and your interviewer have.
So do you kind of have any other tips when it comes to interviewing virtually in specific and the unique challenges it brings that you can think of?
I think a lot of the same rules apply, quite honestly. I still think you should dress for the job that you want, not the job you have. That's kind of my my motto that I live by. So you should still get yourself ready for an interview in that same way. You should, be dressed for the role that you want. You should be, instead of bringing a resume to the interview, you should be sending your most recent resume ahead of time. You should still follow up with the same components you would if you were in person, where there's a thank you letter after. I just think a lot of those fundamental things don't change when you are in a remote environment.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So one of the things, that I'm sort of thinking about is we're talking a lot about sort of interviewing virtually, but I'm wondering if we could also touch base on just the different types of interviews, because for example, some companies might start with a phone screening or, a team screening, and then there's obviously maybe a on-demand video interview where you're not really interacting with somebody. That can be really challenging as well. And then there's sort of, hopefully when we, get back to a different time, we might have the on-site sort of in person. But do you happen to have any tips for the different types of interviews that students could experience?
Yeah, so I think at least what we typically do, and this is true of our internship positions as well as our full-time direct hire positions, we're typically always going to start with a phone screen. Mm-hmm. So you're going to submit your resume via our website or Handshake or an application like that, and then we're going to start with a phone call. And that phone call is typically with a member of our HR team. And really, for our purposes, that phone screen is that initial, are we checking all the boxes? Do you have the qualifications, the experience, the education we need for the role? Are your communication skills where they need to be? So we're just really going over the basics. In my experience, we're not really assessing too much into the day-to-day of the role, nor do we have as much exposure as you may think the HR team does to the day-to-day. I mean, we know what's going on, but we're not living and breathing that job on a daily basis. So we're just kind of checking the boxes and doing that initial screen. So when the hiring manager gets those resumes, they already know, hey, these people are qualified. So you're not really being sent to the manager, at least in our organization, until you've checked those initial boxes. For most of our entry-level positions, there's only going to be one in-person or Zoom interview. Now, you may be meeting with multiple people, but it's not a multiple-step interview process. So you'll typically be meeting with your direct hiring manager, sometimes their manager, depending on the role. And then sometimes you'll meet more in a group interview type setting to get to meet the team. I would say those team type of interviews, they're not really there to assess your qualifications or your past experience. It's just kind of getting a flavor of what the team dynamic is and how you would fit into that. Because especially when you have a small team, it's really important that everyone meshes well together. So those are the two that we typically see. Now, as you move forward in your career, I think that's when companies start introducing the second and the third interview. It also depends a lot on how visible your role is. And by visible, I mean, are you going to be on the front page of the company website? Are you going to be talking to the really high stakes clients, or are you coming in at the bottom? And then when you do work your way up, of course, you'll have built those relationships. But as you seek to transition into a more client facing role, you may see more interviews in that process.
That makes a lot of sense. I've had all of those before, but sometimes instead of that phone interview, they'll do the on-demand video interviews, which are always a fun time. Where I don't have recording yourself.
I don't have much exposure to those. It's not something that we have introduced. To be honest, I've had some experience as a candidate, and I will promise you, even though I work at HR, I find them as nerve-wracking as everybody else does, because you just don't have any feedback, right? I mean, we're so used to interviewing. You can kind of see, okay, am I going off track? Am I doing what I need to do? Or is it making sense? You just don't get that feedback. And I really think that's why those interviews are so difficult.
So Jessica, what would be your tips? Because you've experienced all three, and we're getting a lot of, so for me, I get a lot of questions from students about like, how do they approach that initial phone screen, or how do they handle sort of the on-demand, interview questions? But you've gone through it. So what are your quick tips?
Yeah. When it comes to the phone call, I always say that's like, just like Becky said, just kind of your general interview. Something that I ran into quite often was sometimes I'd have an HR person asking me questions, and sometimes I would have an actuary asking me questions. And so I would have to make sure I would know who I'm speaking to, because I'd ask a very technical question and the HR person would be like, I'm not an actuary, I actually don't know. And so that's kind of a tip that I give, is if you're in one of those like fields that are a little technical, to make sure you know who you're talking to. And it just, just be yourself, and, be able to talk about everything on your resume, because that's what I found was most commonly asked about, was like, hey, how did this job work? What did you learn from these skills? So that's kind of my biggest tip, is know your resume inside and out and know who you're talking to. And when it comes to the on-demand one, I say the same thing, except no one's responding to you. They're typically the same questions you get in a phone interview, but it's just you and the camera. Sometimes you get to re-record, sometimes you don't get to re-record. So I would just kind of practice the same questions I would for a phone interview, set up a nice background, dress nice still for those, because, multiple people are going to be watching them. And, if you can re-record, that's great. If not, you do your best and submit them. But we also have, here at North Central, we have Big Interview, where it can help to practice answering some of those questions and recording yourself on a screen. That was really helpful for me to prepare as well.
And I will add to that, I think preparation is key for any step in an interview process. You should always be paying attention to who you're interviewing with, as Jessica mentioned, because again, your HR person's not doing it day to day. I wish I knew everything about every role, but I just don't have that capability. So know who you're talking to, come prepared. There's a great thing. You can go on LinkedIn, you can find people, you can understand their background, you can see how they fit in the organization, but it's so key to research the company too. And I especially think as you're leaning towards graduation or even an internship, you are playing a game of quantity. You are applying for lots of roles. Keep a spreadsheet, know where you're applying, keep track of those companies. And when you do have phone interviews and you do have in-person interviews, have that ready to go. Make sure you have notes on that and you're prepared, because it definitely shows, even if you don't necessarily say anything super specific from your notes during that call, you can tell who came prepared and you can tell who's just going from interview to interview to interview.
What are some specific things you think students could research? Because I've always run into that problem, is everyone's like, research the company. Does that mean like, every single news article? Does that mean you just know what they do at a surface level? Like, what would you suggest students look into?
So I would always say, start on their website. And I think where I like to begin is the About page. So understand a basic idea. You're not going to understand everything the company does, but understand at a base level what they're doing. For example, Millennium Trust is a financial service institution. We act as a custodian. If you don't know what a custodian is, go look up what a custodian is in financial services. So just kind of have that base level. And if there's something that you look into more and you're saying, hey, I was doing this research and I just can't really figure this out, can you help me understand? That shows that you at least tried to do the research and you're wanting to learn more. I also think companies are doing a great job of putting their culture out on their website. So I think culture is key for your first job, because anytime you get your first job, every single task you do is not going to be what you imagined it was going to be when you were in college. It's that you have to work your way up. And so a lot of that too is, even if you're doing something every day that's not glamorous or glorious or what you thought it was going to be, that culture and who you work with is what keeps you coming back every day. So make sure you do some research on the culture. And if you really can't get a good idea from their website, especially when you're talking to in those entry level screens with the HR employees, ask them those things. That's our bread and butter. It might not be the day to day, but our bread and butter is knowing our culture and what keeps people and what brings people in the door.
That helps a lot, actually. It's always the hardest thing to research. What is the research?
And have your questions prepared as you're researching. Write down your questions. Have those notes with you when you interview, and then when you get asked, hey, do you have any questions, then you're not blank staring at them like, wait a minute, I don't actually have anything. You already have those questions prepared, and write down 15, because 5 of them will get answered as they're talking, and then you still have 10 more that you can pull from, and you're not asking the same question to every single person in the interview.
I like that. I definitely had a bank of questions that I had, and then I had company specific questions every time. Especially now that we're virtual, you can kind of cheat a little bit, and you can put your questions on a Post-it note on the side of your screen, so you don't have to memorize them all.
And you know what? Come with a notebook. I have never once judged someone in an interview for having a portfolio notebook with them where they're taking notes and their notes are there. We know you're interviewing for a lot of things. We want to show that you're putting the effort in. We want to see that. So it's okay to come prepared with notes, just like you would in class. I mean, it's your job is getting the job when you graduate, and we understand that.
I'm so glad that you said that, because that's really one of the questions that I receive a lot from students. Is it okay for me to have a notebook? Is it okay for me to write things down? Because, let's be honest, I think interviewing can be anxiety provoking. Who isn't nervous during an interview? And there are times when you're going to get asked a question and you're going to draw a blank, just like what you said. Like, do you have any questions? And you draw a blank. You would be able to open your portfolio, or however it is, whatever you put your questions on, and then it just sort of allows you to sort of be more in the moment, as opposed to thinking that you have to have all of this in your head when you're interviewing, And so I think that that's a really good point. But I do want to ask you, so what happens when you get thrown a curveball and all of a sudden either it leaves your mind or you don't know how to answer it? So what would you recommend somebody do?
Well, I would say it's okay to have a moment of silence. I think part of the anxiety provoking portion of interviews is you feel like you have to answer immediately. And I've learned through my 4 years at Millennium that a lot of the people who lead our company, when you ask them a question, even in a meeting, they take about 10 seconds to pause and really collect their own thoughts before they put that out. And I think that's something key in an interview. Honestly, the only one who's feeling awkward about the pause is you, because you're feeling like it's taking longer, when in reality, the person who's interviewing you, it's not taking as long as it is to you personally. Obviously, don't pause for like a minute and a half, but if you need to take 10, 15 seconds to kind of collect your thoughts, and you can even say something like, you know what, that's a great question. Let me think about that for a moment. And if they do ask you something that you truly don't know, I am a big proponent of saying, you know what, that has escaped my mind. I need to go back and take a look, and I will get back to you with that answer. I think it's better to admit that you're human and say, hey, I need to get back to you, than try to make something up on the spot that either doesn't make any sense or isn't true because you're trying to answer that question. That's not the best look. And we know that every human goes through having a blank mind for a moment.
I remember taking pauses in my interviews sometimes. And at first it's weird, but then it just kind of seems normal after a while.
And we're used to it. I mean, that's what you have to remember. The person interviewing you is probably doing this a large portion of their job. So it's not that they're as nervous as you are. And also remember, they're just people. At the end of the day, the only difference between you and them when you're graduating is you haven't had your first job and they have their first, second, or third job here. That's the only difference. But at the end of the day, we're all human, and people will grant you more grace than I think you sometimes grant yourself.
Great words of wisdom. We need to write that down somewhere.
I have to remind myself of that on the daily, so that just comes to mind. It's okay to grant yourself a little grace.
something that I wanted to ask when it comes to, interview questions is I feel like when other people ask me for advice, they're always like, what kind of questions do they ask? How do I prepare? And they're always Googling, like, what questions does Google ask you in an interview? So are there any sort of questions you think that a student should always have prepared and kind of almost be expected to answer? They don't have to be specific to your company. I think you can't disclose that, but just general questions that would probably be asked in almost any interview.
I think you should always be prepared to go over your experience. And one of the things that I mentioned earlier, in a virtual environment, you have to kind of send your resume. But in an in-person interview, please bring your resume. I mean, we would hope that the interviewer has that printed, but it really does say a lot when you're prepared and you have a printed resume. And I still love resume paper. I may be an old soul when I say that, but it shows that extra step, and I appreciate those little details. And I think so, always be prepared to go through your resume and share how seemingly unapplicable experience is applicable. For example, maybe you worked at Hardee's in high school and you're like, well, that doesn't apply to me being an accountant. Well, but in a sense it does. I mean, you had to work hard, you had to adhere to a schedule, you had to work with others. There's definitely transferable skills that you should always know to pull from your resume to any role that you're looking for. I also think you should have kind of a bank of examples. A big trend lately is the behavioral interview, where it's give me an example of a time you made a mistake and how did you go about correcting that? Or what's a strength, what's a weakness, give me an example. So you should always have a clear example. And when you're sharing an example, if it is something negative, like they're asking you, hey, did you make a mistake? How did you fix that? Know and prepare how to turn that around. The weakness question is one I get asked about a lot when a company asks, what's your weakness? You should not stop with, I am not good at delegating. That should not be the end of your answer. It should be, I am not good at delegating, but here's the 3 things I've been doing to improve that weakness of mine. Because I think it's all about how you can show an example, how you can relate it to the work you're going to be doing, and really just how you present yourself at the end of the day.
Yep, I think that's really helpful. It's so interesting that you brought up the weakness question, because I would say that that's something that students frequently ask us is, how do I answer that weakness question? And, often, I'll tell students that the interview is really looking for sort of, like your honesty, but really, how are you working on it? I think to pretend that we don't have weaknesses, or we don't have an area that we're working on. But I like how you're saying that when you're giving an example, make sure you elaborate on it. The one thing that I would add attached, to that is, in preparing what we often call those STAR responses, situation, task, action, result, is really making sure you sort of have a tight story, because I would imagine as an interviewer that it can be challenging if a story sort of meanders everywhere and you have to come back and sort of ask them, multiple questions. So the preparation is key, sort of having those 10 to 12 stories that you can actually share for the employer that really highlight your unique strengths and skills. I think is really important, and to practice it out loud, because because it's really different, when you're talking to somebody, or like when you're giving a speech. It's different when you imagine what you want to say versus actually giving the speech in front of a class. You have to practice out loud.
One tip I have, and this has helped me a lot. I used to actually have a fear of public speaking, and it was a really hard thing for me actually when I was at North Central. And somebody told me that you should practice your speech or your interview in front of a mirror, because you're your own worst critic. So you can kind of see every, weird twitch or tick that you have while you're talking. And it also, when you start to talk too long, you start to see that on your own face. And that's been really helpful. And I will say, now that I've been with Millennium for about 4 years, I actually public speak quite often, and I've had to speak to the entire company. And if you told me that when I was a freshman at North Central, I would have said, forget that. And now they tap my shoulder and say, hey, Becky, will you go speak? So there's definitely things you can do to prepare. And if public speaking is one of your weaknesses, that's a great example. Hey, I'm teaching myself, I'm putting myself in hard situations, I'm stretching myself, and I'm trying to get better at that. But it's just all about growth. We want to see people who are self-aware and willing to grow. I think self-awareness is a trait that is really overlooked, but if you're aware of your own weaknesses and you show that you want to take stride to improve them, that's really all we can ask for.
I've had that weakness question. I've had to answer it and flip it around all the time. It's always I always say too, if you can't ever think of strengths and weaknesses, to ask your friends what they think your strengths and weaknesses are, because they can be more honest sometimes than you can be to yourself. And so it helps a little bit.
Ask your mom. Always ask your mom or your dad, because they will tell you, and they will have some brutal, honest answers. But let me tell you, that was something I did because I thought I had no weaknesses. I have since corrected my own thought process, but that was something that helped me. I asked a lot of my friends. I asked my spouse, I asked my parents, and you'll get some good answers, and it makes you reflect a little bit too. And I think that reflection is how we improve.
I think that's really a great tip, because I think what happens is that for many people, it's really hard for us to think about our strengths and our weaknesses. And there are some things that we do naturally that we just sort of take for granted, and we don't think about them as strengths. And that and we are overlooking that potential employers or graduate programs highly value those types of skills. So I think that making sure that you're sort of, connecting with that inner circle of trusted advisors, that include family, I think is really, pretty important, So this has been just amazing advice. I know that we're sort of coming up almost on 33 minutes, and I'm wondering if, we have any final thoughts that we want to share with, our listeners, because we've covered a lot of topics.
I will just reiterate, please, please, please prepare. And the thank you letter is not dead. One of the things that and you laugh, but I swear I can count probably on two hands the number of thank you letters I have gotten from entry-level candidates. My internship candidates do a great job. I know it's something that career development told us, and that really sticks during that process. But as people start to progress in the workforce, that thank you letter becomes a dying art, and it really sticks out, because what's great about sending that a couple days later is after that interview, everything you said is really fresh, and they're really high on you, and then they interview 3 more people, and that thank you letter is a nice little reminder of like, hey, I'm still here and I still really want this job. And it also gives you the opportunity to say, I heard you during the interview. I heard you say these couple things, and this is why I feel like I would fit those great, or here's what I can do to improve the company. So the little extra steps that you take when you really want a position do not go unnoticed by a hiring team.
Right. I laugh because I love your sense of humor. I thought that was just, I loved how you said that, and I know we're coming up on time, but you made me think about something else, Becky, that I wanted to ask you, is that I love the point about how, the thank you letter, the email thank you letter can really set you apart, particularly in this, what can be a really competitive, and we know a really competitive job market right now. So thank you for bringing that up. The other question that we get from students is follow-up. So, my tip would be, don't leave the interview until you know sort of the next step, or the, the hiring timeline. But students are often hesitant to follow up, or they feel if they followed up more than once and they haven't heard back, from the recruiter, that they don't know what to do, and they don't want to appear like a pest. But what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I would say my tip too is to always ask at the end of the interview, what are the next steps and when can I expect to hear back from you? I think if they provide you, you can expect to hear back from us in a week, then the appropriate follow-up time, wait that amount of time and then follow up. After that, I would say if they don't really provide you anything, I think weekly is a safe bet to not be too overly eager, but also still get those follow-ups. And I would also say know who to follow up with. That's something I have found that we've experienced issues with because, for example, HR does the phone screens, the hiring manager does the interview, but then we have executive assistants who set up the interviews. And so sometimes candidates are following up with those assistants when in reality, the assistant's like, I don't really know. I'm just here to set up that interview. So make sure you also understand who you should be following up with because they'll be expecting that from you. And then you can follow up with the correct person. And sometimes it's okay to pick up the phone. That's also something. Don't always send an email. If you're really eager about something, pick up the phone, check in. That personal touch really, I can't say enough about that component. That's also a dying art. It's okay to talk on the phone, pick up the phone, have a conversation. I can say I get 150 emails a day, so the phone call is definitely going to stick out versus all the other emails that I'm receiving on a day-to-day basis.
I like that. That's a great note to end on, I think.
Well,
thank you guys.
Yeah, well, I was going to say thank you, Becky, for joining us today. It was wonderful to have an NCC alum come back and help give us some tips. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for a podcast. And we hope you join us next week.